Recording in progress.
It's March 3rd, 2022. And this is a conversation between myself, Marc Applebaum, I'm the president of Itlaq Foundation, and Yannis Toussulis, the primary spiritual advisor to Itlaq Foundation.
Okay. The subject of this video is why bother with God? So the reason we put it in that way, at least I do, is because most people could care less about the question of God, it seems, at least from the way they live and from their behavior. They're far more concerned, and understandably so, with just getting by in life. Life presents itself as a form of what some philosophers call brute being. That is, it's immediate, it's raw, it's up in your face, and there's a lot to deal with in life. It's not an easy matter to get through life at all. So the questions of what might lie behind it all, or whether it has some kind of ultimate meaning, is actually a question that might only arise if you have the luxury to ask it. Yeah. Now, that would mean that very few people actually do have that luxury. So the question is, why is it that so many people who don't seem to have the luxury to ask the question have that question arise in them in the first place anyway? Because certainly this is not a question of the rich and privileged. This is a question that seems to erupt in the midst of even the greatest poverty among people who are struggling to just survive. So why does that question arise in the first place? And for me, it's one that arises in turn out of the need to discover some form of meaning behind all of this. Does this have meaning at all? Is this all just a random accident? This meaning life itself.
Yeah.
And this is a major question.
Meaning my life.
Meaning my life in particular, but life in general.
Sure.
And this seems to be the conclusion, in fact, of physicalists who are strictly materialists. That is, that the universe came into being randomly and by accident. That's, of course, a question that can't be answered, whether or not it can't be ultimately answered. And so
by natural science.
By natural science or by any other rational means. Yeah. That's the light that went down. So I'm going to pause for a minute. So after fixing the light that just fell down, there's something that's now recognized by scientists, particularly physicists, and but also other scientists, mathematicians, etc., which is called the hard problem of consciousness, whether consciousness exists, let alone anything like an ultimate form of all-knowingness, let's call it, that we might designate as God. So it's a question that's alive in philosophy, in science, but more importantly, it's a question that's more immediately alive in the experience of many people who seek a deeper meaning. So I suppose that answers the question, why bother with God? What about you?
Yeah, it strikes me that the why bother is why bother knowing God, not why bother asking God for something.
Yeah.
In other words, many people and extremists are going to call out to God, but that's not what we're talking about.
No, because that already is contingent upon somebody believing in God in the first place.
Yeah.
Now, of course, there are exceptions to that. There are people who are, let's call them unbelievers, who in a moment of great stress or in an emergency will call upon God anyway. There are no atheists in foxholes, is the old saying.
Right.
Yeah. But let's put that aside for the moment. So if there is something like God or a God, and I don't like to put it that way, let's say God. As Paul Tillich once put it, God would represent an ultimate value for many people. by which he meant that the value behind all values,
Mhm.
that which gives meaning to the whole of life and to the quest for meaning.
Mhm.
So that's why one might bother with God. And there might be more existential reasons.
Yeah, for sure. In my case, that's what it was.
Yeah, why don't you say
More
something
existential.
about
Well, I think it goes to the question of it is if why would one bother with God if one isn't compelled to bother about God?
that? Mhm.
And to me, I was compelled from a pretty young age around what's that ultimate value, but ultimate value is ultimate ground.
Mhm,
What's the
mhm,
really real here?
mhm.
Not just inside of myself, but anywhere.
Does that include your own sense of self-identity being
Yeah,
grounded?
all of it was wrapped up in
Okay,
all of it for me, all of
all
it.
right.
So I could come up as a kid and then as a teenager with many ways not to believe in various versions of who I was.
Yeah.
Uh, so who am I really, and what is this really? It was sort of the same question somehow.
Right, right, right. So right away, it seems to me that the question of God
Yeah.
is immediately what it immediately implicates is there even a self here who can ask the question, a self
Yeah.
of any certainty, but of any real ground, having any real ground for its
Yeah.
own existence,
Yeah.
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 So self and God immediately are intimately related,
There you go.
the reality of both. And of course, there's certain traditions, and I'm thinking immediately of Buddhism, which question the reality of both.
Right.
Whether there really is a self and whether there really is a God.
Mhm.
And yet, even in Buddhism, we have the sense of an underlying ground, which is simultaneously or paradoxically an unground.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which I guess I can only point to by saying a form of all pervasive primordial consciousness that suffuses the whole of reality, which, while having no self, no center, no circumscribed existence as an entity might have, for example,
Right.
still is the ultimate reality.
Yeah.
Therefore, the ultimate value, and so on and so forth.
And in which case, who
Yeah.
finds that?
Yeah.
The question's answered for them.
That's right. And so people refer to that to the common term enlightenment.
Right.
So what is that? What does it mean to be enlightened? It doesn't mean what the European Enlightenment was all about,
Right.
which was attaining to a high level of maturity through a well-developed rationality, but rather through arriving at an epistemological sense of certainty through the direct perception of an all-pervasive reality with a capital R.
Yeah.
Which becomes then the most important foundation for a person's sense of security in the whole of life.
Right.
Yeah.
Having set aside a dogmatic kind of air sense security.
Well, that raises another question.
In terms of enlightenment.
Well, yeah, but now that raises the whole question of can you arrive at such a direct form of perception is what's being implied here, which doesn't depend upon some form of belief or an intellectual conviction in propositional truth, is the way I define belief.
Yeah.
And of course, I spent many years in my doctoral work exploring that very question. Can one experience faith without subscribing to a particular belief, which in turn becomes dogmatic or doctrinaire?
Yeah.
Well, the only way one could do that is through some form of direct experience of the ultimate reality that we're referring to as God.
Yeah.
At least potentially.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So how can you get to that? And the intellectual traditions don't point a way to that. They're limited by the limits of rationality, of reasoning. Ergo, there are a number of sacred traditions which purport, at least, to have a way to develop one's intuitive capacity to such a degree that it's able to arrive at a certain form of gnosis or direct knowing of what we're calling reality, capital R. Yeah. Okay. So then the next question I would ask is why, among all those traditions, which are now available in the free market
Right.
or the marketplace of ideas,
Right.
why would one say choose Sufism, which is what we've been involved with, over, for example, one of the many Buddhist or Hindu paths, or
Right.
mystical Christianity or mystical Judaism?
Mhm.
Yeah. And I hate to frame it that way because it sounds like you're going shopping for something.
Well,
But-
it also sounds like we conceive of what we're doing as an ism, among other isms.
Well, there we go. So
Yeah.
that of course, that now raises the question of whether Sufism is the proper term for what we're doing. Is it an
Yeah.
ism, therefore some form of ideology and so on and so forth?
All that.
Okay, all of that's very interesting, but how do we cram that into
Yeah.
this little presentation?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, let me stick with the question. Why would you or I be drawn to Sufism as opposed to many of the other rich traditions that exist out there that are available to Westerners?
Yeah. I mean, my own story, is very, you're really familiar with that. And I was raised in Judaism, not particularly observant, but enough immersed in that, enough intrigued and interested in that tradition as a historical one, as a scriptural one, and all of it, to feel like I was swimming in all the imagery and stories of Judaism, but without finding an answer to the question that I mentioned earlier about the ultimately real.
Oh, well, you could have followed, for example, the Kabbalistic path. Why not?
Yeah, it could have happened. And I think I think that, on the other hand, at the same time, I was looking for something broadly, for whatever reason, broadly Abrahamic. So because I didn't want to feel narrowly, I hadn't encountered anything like that within Judaism. It could have happened, but in my case, in my history, it didn't. But I felt like there were clues around there. So who is speaking in a way that at least those chords in me that resonate with the Abrahamic tradition writ large, meaning Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, that from a young age felt like they shared so much to me, particularly Islam. I felt convinced as a kid was very close to Judaism. For whatever reason, I sort of felt that conviction. What's in any of that? Because it felt familiar but different. So I think that's why, even when I first started to run into people who were presenting themselves as Sufi sheikhs, you know, it was like a couple of clicks over from a rabbi, but the basic appearance wasn't that different to me in terms of just iconography of, you know, the cultural iconography was familiar enough. And even the gestural language was close enough to me. So that's part of the story for me. The stories, the prophets, to read the Quran without also recognizing the Torah is impossible. In the stories of Moses, for example, which are right there. So anyhow, that was part of the beginning.
Yeah, so at least Islam and the Quran in particular makes references to both Judaism and Christianity.
Right.
So I could ask myself the same question: is it at least a nominal Christian? Because my parents were largely secular.
Right.
Why was I drawn to Sufism? Well, initially I wasn't. As a child, I was drawn to go deeper into Christianity and became familiar with the Christian mystics. And then shortly after, other traditions, Buddhist and Vedantic, Hindu, Advaitin traditions. And in fact, I explored those traditions first.
Yeah.
Though I have to say that in 1968, I think it was, I was introduced to the work of Idris Shah, and particularly his first book, published I think in 1964, The Sufis, which I read, and which immediately struck me as familiar. And by familiar, I mean something closer to what I know, but also familiar in the sense of family-like.
Right.
somehow I felt like I belonged to that family.
Right.
But anyway, I mean, more general terms, I think Sufism is interesting to explore because Western civilization is based upon the three monotheisms. If you had to define Western civilization, you would have to say it's based upon the three monotheisms.
Mhm.
Now, that's not a very common idea. The common idea is,
Sure.
well, Western civilization is based on the so-called Judeo-Christian tradition.
Right.
What's Islam got to do with it?
Right.
And in fact, historically, it's not the case because Islam had a great impact on the development of European civilization. So that's why I'm expanding it to Judeo-Christian and Islamic. Okay, well, what else? It's also based on the inheritance or the legacy of late Hellenism. In other words, the Greek traditions prior to the formation of, not prior to Judaism, certainly not, alongside Judaism, but prior to Christianity as we know it, Pauline Christianity, and certainly prior to the revelations given to Muhammad, which began in the 7th century. So all of that legacy of late Hellenistic thought became a common language, I would say, between Jewish, Christian, and Muslim mystics who were developing and who needed a language to develop a particular form of cosmology that would describe what their gnosis was aiming at. So the late Hellenistic tradition, some call it Neoplatonist, some call it Hermetic, some call it a combination thereof, infused all three of these monotheisms in ways which we know historically. But more than historically, the Sufi path is structured according to, many would say, a Neoplatonic view of cosmology. And that Neoplatonic view is also common to Judaism in its mystical form, Kabbalah, and it's also known to Christian mystics, especially in the Eastern Orthodox tradition. So there's something familiar about all of that, even if you don't know about it intellectually. It feels closer to home. Okay. So why Sufism? Because there's a certain taste, a certain aesthetic, which lies closer to home for many Westerners than do the aesthetic expressions and even the cosmologies of the Indo-Semitic traditions, Indo-Semitic and Tibetan traditions. Okay. I think we can pause here.
Sure.